Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. On this platform, we talk about issues that impact social justice locally and globally. Today, I am very excited. We'll be talking about something that is very close to my heart. My guest, Rabia Khokhar, is an elementary school teacher in Toronto. She's very passionate about equity, social justice education, and she tries to ensure how her teaching practices are embedded in this framework. Rabia has a Master's of Education in Social Justice Education and Diploma in Education in Urban Environment concurrently, as well as Rabia has completed Inclusive Classroom Specialist additional qualifications courses. Rabia has taught across different places and also in different places in Toronto. I mean, Rabia has grown up in Canada, grown up in Toronto. I have come to Canada in my 30s, mid 30s. So there are so many things that I don't know about Canada. There are so many things that I don't understand. I mean, my understanding, a lot of it is theoretical. However, I engage very critically and actively, and I'm always passionate about learning more things about social justice. As an educator myself, I couldn't tell you enough that how we need space for critical consciousness. We need space for develop critical thinking. That doesn't happen all the time, and this is not only unique to Bangladesh; it is across the world. And I think our conversation, our dialogue today a lot of it will debunk the myth about Canadian education system, because from Bangladesh, we think everything in Canada is perfect. So I think a lot of it will be debunked. So Rabia, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and share and learn with you. I love all of your work, so it's such an honor to be here and share space with you all.
Thank you, Rabia. First of all, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, absolutely personal about yourself, so that us and the audience can get a sense of who is Rabia?
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. So my name is Rabia Khokhar. I'm an elementary teacher in Toronto. I'm also an education and equity consultant. I was born in Pakistan and I came to Canada when I was 6. So a lot of my schooling experiences and my lived experience is very much in Toronto. And, this is really the place where I've grown up. But, I've always felt like I'm in the middle of two spaces where, I'm trying to navigate this space where, I'm Pakistani, Canadian, and I'm trying to navigate who I am and how I come to this work as an educator. So I think, I'm very passionate about equity and social justice because I really feel that's really the way and the vehicle through which we can create sustainable change and really create inclusion for people of all intersectional identities. And so my experiences as a teacher, I've had the honor to teach, different grades, different subjects, and also in different spaces, like geographic spaces in Toronto. And that's really impacted me. And it's really helped me open my eyes to what social justice and equity looks like in different spaces in a very contextual way. So I'm really interested in taking the theory of social justice and putting it into practice in very relevant and responsive ways for the students that, I have the honor to teach. And, I think this idea of wanting to become a teacher is very much embedded in my own lived experience. As a visible racialized Muslim woman, I've always wanted to be a teacher since I was 4 years old. I fell in love with teaching. And so, I always wanted to be a teacher. It wasn't necessarily a job. It was almost a calling and a way of life. But as I was growing up in Toronto, I didn't really see any teachers who looked like me or any people who looked like me or had my identities in the school space. And so, I had this dream and this wish in my heart, but I never really thought I could actually become a teacher because I never really saw any representation of people who looked like me in this role. So for a long time, I was just like, well, maybe this is not something I can become because, no one is wearing a hijab or no one has an identity that's similar to mine. So this issue of representation and, my passion to have representation of all types of people and all types of jobs and experiences is very central, because if we can't see ourselves represented, then we don't think that we can strive to be that. And so I feel like, with a lot of like the privileges and the opportunities that I have now, or that have come my way, has almost forced me to become the representation that I so needed as a young child, to really have people who look like us in all types of places. And I think, for all of those ways, that's really like my positionality to this work as a teacher, and really as a person in Toronto, like just trying to be critical and, navigate my space and do something like positive with that positional power now as an educator.
Thank you, Rabia. That's a beautiful answer, and something that helps us actually to understand a lot of the context. I often tell, as an educator myself, and I loved when you said that you did not think that teaching is a job, it's a calling. I mean, I don't mean to trivialize or hurt anyone's feeling, a religious feeling about it. Well, I did not know what my calling is. I was born in a small village in Bangladesh, and in a large family. Bangladesh, used to be part of Pakistan, so in a lot of the cultural context, a lot of the social realities, being also growing up in a Muslim family, I did not know how teaching is different from life, if that makes any sense. I mean,
Yeah, that's
so
beautiful.
I have, we are 7 brothers, 4 sisters. So I'm the first in my family to go to university. So I never felt, so I was, as a child, very early on, you'll probably laugh at this. I say that I started teaching when I was in 8th grade. When I say this, Rabia, I kid you not. So, I mean, my parents, we come from a very humble background, and obviously my parents couldn't support all of their children, 11 children. So I needed to teach to survive. Let's say in villages of Bangladesh, you have a thing where you live in another person's house, help them with the household chores, and also teach their children. And then you go to school, public school system, right? So when you said that teaching is a calling, but now when I teach, I feel like, to me, it is my prayer. I mean, I pray. I mean, I'm not saying that this is I'm not trying to hurt anyone's religious feeling.
Yeah.
But I think when I teach, I'm most alive. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that totally does. Yes. It's so close to your heart, it's almost like who you are.
So the other thing that is probably important for us to understand is that no text has any meaning without the context. So once I met a very prominent scholar in a conference, and I'm impressed how he can write very deep things in very simple language. It's almost deceptively simple, but profound, very profound. I asked him that how do you write so profound but yet use so simple language? Then he quoted Gramsci and said, look, your life leaves an infinity of traces in your consciousness. Go to those experiences, go to those events, and try to make sense of the theory. A lot of the times we teach as if like life is different from teaching. Question to you, Rabia. What is social justice education to you, and why should it start at the elementary level?
Yeah, as you were talking, I really thought about like the accessibility of this discourse and this theoretical discourse. And, a little while ago, I came across this, I think it was a quote, but it said something like, if being like an activist, or if learning the language of social justice is moving me away from my family and those people who might not have accessibility to this language and this jargon, then there's almost no point in it. So, my idea of social justice and social justice education is very much embedded in the accessibility of this language, and, knowing that, there is privilege that we have in terms of knowing this language and having had whatever access. We worked hard to, do these degrees or whatever, but then, using our positional power to create accessibility, to really take this language of social justice into all parts of our experiences and people who are close to us, whether that's our family and our students, is very much foundational to my understanding of social justice education. And so, going back to your question of what social justice education to me is, in my research, I learned that social justice education, or social justice, is kind of like traditionally a concept of how things or goods were distributed in a society to ensure fairness for all people. And so how that relates to education then, for me, and my understanding, is really how social justice is a vehicle to really create inclusion for children of all identities, and not like having oppressive measures limit who they are based on who they are. And I think social justice education recognizes and understands that there are systemic issues and systemic oppressive systems that are in place that really impact the experiences of children of various identities. And I think, social justice education recognizes that there needs to be individual changes to create change. There needs to be individual changes as well as systemic changes. So they go hand in hand. We can't have only individual changes without having systems, because social justice education really recognizes that the systems are unfair, for people of intersectional identities. And I think, what I find really beautiful about social justice education and equity work is this foundation of hopefulness, that, we each can create a change to make things more fair in our local and broader communities. So I think that's, where the impact is, knowing that, if something is unfair, that we can create change. And I think that's one of the reasons that it has to start in elementary school. If we recognize that, our world is not fair for people of all identities, intersectional identities, then we have to start with our children, because they are our foundation and our future. And, that might sound visionary, but we often think that, we don't want to expose them to these things and we'll wait until they're like older. But children have always been parts of, movements to create social change. And if we want them to carry on this work and do this work, we have to start at the foundations, because that's really where, they can make sense of their own experiences, whether it's their own lived experiences or things that they're seeing in the world. With a trusted adult, they can make sense of what's happening in the world. I think, it offers a lot of vocabulary building and, building up to what's happening in a very responsive, relevant, scaffolding way. And I think we can always create change and we can always make a difference. So children need to know that they are change makers, and if something is unfair, which I think children have this innate sense of what's fair and what's unfair. So if we can mobilize on that, the conditions are just perfect to engage in social justice education. We almost have the framework and the foundations already there with us.
Thank you, Rabia. The other thing connected to that is whether we teach our children social justice or not, there are apparatus, there are things around us that will not stop teaching our kids. I mean, for instance, one might argue that state is pedagogic. State is itself, as an institution, is constantly teaching who is deserving of humanity, who is deserving of rights, compassion and care, and who doesn't. Think about what happens at the border. Border is a very modern idea, and very European colonial idea, to be very precise. But the border can decide if somebody deserves to live or not. Also, media, it's all pervasive, right? So I think that media is almost it's almost like oxygen. It's all around us, and we don't see it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I also connect this with a notable scholar that I often go back to him is that Mark Fisher. He has a very small book. It's called Capitalist Realism.
Mm-hmm.
That and at one point he says this, that you can think like in a dystopian movie, the end of the world, but you can think of an alternative which is not capitalist. That's how it
Mm-hmm.
seeps into our psyche, seeps into our consciousness. So if we don't start resisting at the elementary level, I don't know what else can we do. I'll
Yeah,
quickly take
so
a
true.
question from Snigdhapa, Professor Snigdha, and now Dr. Snigdha. Snigdha has just, completed her dissertation, and that's very important dissertation. I'm so proud of her completion. Um, so Snigdha is asking Dr. Snigdha is asking the question. I'm sorry. I know that Snigdha is laughing. But she knows that. Uh, so how do we differentiate representation and identity politics, hijab? Like how, I mean, you were born in Pakistan. I'm sure that you have a lot of family back in Pakistan. Um, I was born in Bangladesh. Now, do you think that the identity politics and the representation, when it comes to hijab, there is a similarity between here and in Bangladesh and in Pakistan? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think identity is always at play. How we're read, how our bodies are read in particular spaces, and so I think because of the way our bodies are read, because of our visible identities, I think that there's always assumptions and ideas that come off of that. Of thinking who we are or what we might be committed to based on what we look like, and I think I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I think, just based on my own experiences, one of the first things that people see when I walk into a space is my hijab. That part of my identity is totally and constantly visible. And I think oftentimes people only see that part of my identity, and they don't really want to explore the other parts of who I am and what those other parts are and how I'm bringing those to the conversation. So I think oftentimes it's like that's the only way that you're seen, and then that's in like maybe professional spaces, and in other spaces, wearing a hijab, you're automatically, there's other things that are coming into play in terms of like you're religious or what it means to be religious, and I think all of those are really based on stereotypes and assumptions, and our bodies sort of I guess when we walk into spaces, that's just how the ways in which our bodies are read, and it's tiring to constantly have to fight to be seen completely. So I think that there are a lot of those issues at play. I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. You have looked into something very, very visible, and I give this example all the time. I never understood this to the extent I understand it now. I'm sure that it's in the forefront of our psyche. What happened in London, Ontario? What happened in Alberta? So the fact is, and Jagmeet Singh has very powerfully said in the Parliament, is that being a Muslim woman and wearing hijab, walking on the street, you are concerned for your life's safety. And also, I think I also want to. I think this question is a perfect segue. Dr. Shongita Roy has asked this question: is that can you reflect on the specificities of how she brings her own location at the intersection of two ethno-cultural identities to inform her everyday engagement with children and young people? So, I mean, so I mean, your identity, you're just not a Muslim woman. You are also a person of color. I dare I say is that if you were a white Muslim woman, would be a bit different. Like, for example, if you're not Rabia, if you are Jennifer, it would be different. You could be wearing hijab. So, and when the children interact with you, they look at, oh, you have an ethnicity, They have a cultural identity. And also, so this is something also interesting. I don't know if you pay attention to this. I have experienced it. So when I came to Canada, I didn't know that people can hear color. So I, like, for instance, because you grew up in Canada, you have a cultural capital. I feel
Yes.
sometimes I don't feel comfortable, sometimes to call it cultural capital, is that this is capital and mine is not capital. The way I speak, my own idiosyncratic ways of speaking is not good enough. So
Right.
when you speak, you have that cultural capital. You know the language. You probably know. I don't know anything about ice hockey, but I
Me
don't have.
neither.
I
But
don't have them.
but I see what you're saying, that, growing up in this space gives, and going through the schooling system in this space, in a schooling system where now I'm an educator, I have this, it is capital, I mean, like, as a racialized person, this capital is different. Like, I can talk about that a little bit, but it's almost this lived experience that has taught me those symbolisms of what this language means, what this word might mean, what this experience is like. So because, I've had that lived experience of going through the system and also growing up here, there is a sense of like capital in that way of knowing, having that lived experience, and that lived experience being my experience. And I know how to like navigate, not necessarily know how to navigate, but, I can understand some of those cultural connections or relevances or, examples. And I think that's big, because there is that cultural capital, but at the same time, my body is not read in that way. So even though I have this like lived experience where I've gone through this system, my body and my visibility of it is not acknowledged or read in that way. So, going back to that example, whenever I walk into a space, whether that's in my daily life or if it's in a professional life, the single story of what a Muslim woman is constantly something that follows me. So, oftentimes people will ask, like, where's the teacher? Or are you like a volunteer? Are you a parent? And so the single story never allows me to be that teacher in that place, even if I'm the only person in that classroom with students, and somebody walks in, that single story never recognizes that my body or me could be educated and could be that teacher in this space and could be working here, So that single story is something that's constantly something that I'm like fighting against, or it's always on my face, and it's always part of my experience, right? And that's like a professional example. If it's in my daily experiences, even if it's an interaction at a store, it's like the shock that I can speak English. It's the questions of like, well, how long have you been here? Where are you from? And so, or, it seems like you're getting used to the winters here. And it's like, all of those are such assumptions based on my visible presenting body. And so, people don't know that, like, I grew up here, or, like I am a teacher, so I think, the single story is always part of my experience. And it, I think the single story, just like the state, and, the conversation that you are having, the single story denotes who deserves respect, dignity, and humanity, because oftentimes the way that I present myself, I am not humanized. My experiences are not humanized. There is often a lack of dignity in the ways in which I engage in the world. And so those are very real things that happen because of the single story and because of my visible identities and the assumptions people have based on that. And I think, going back to the question, being aware of all of this and sort of like trying to be critical in my own experiences helps me think critically about the experiences that I want to create for my students. And so a lot of my work is very intentionally like disrupting those single stories, and a lot of my work is through like resources and thinking critically about curriculum, because curriculum often presents a single story about people where people are silenced, erased, or a certain view is centered. So in my work, whether I'm working with racially diverse and culturally diverse children or all white children, identity children, it's always to bring forward stories that really show a complete perspective. And I feel like because my identity has always been reduced to a single story, I feel very passionate about then. I feel like it's one of the only things I can do in this like capitalistic system is to fight back by presenting holistic stories about people of all identities.
I think for our audiences, when you say the phrase single story, are you referring to Chimamanda Adichie's
yes
conceptualization of single story? So those of you
yes.
who are not familiar with, I mean, I know that at least a lot of my students back in Bangladesh are not familiar with the idea of single story.
Mm-hmm.
Is a very prominent writer in America. She talks about that how she, being a Black student in America, her friend perceived her in one story, that this is who she is, and how she, in her own house growing up, the power of single story. Now, you have explained, you have talked to something which is very relevant, and I'm going to push us, both of us, to a challenging situation, which is so Fannie Lou Hamer, one of her very, very powerful observations is that nobody's free until everybody's free. So if we think about all the different vectors of oppression, how it actually impacts our life, I try to be forever very, very mindful when I speak in a space that I share the space with others. At least I know for sure that being born in a small village is that how the idea of being educated, I mean, if you would speak Bangla, you would probably know this, is that the idea of bhadralok, the educated people, and all of that, they mean, and how we actually carry violence symbolically with our language, with the way we carry ourselves. Now, the difficulties as members of Muslim communities, a lot of the times we try to shy away, we don't want to try to talk about it, is that we have multiple vectors of difficulties. State is not understanding the complexities of your stories. For instance, I'm going to put our cards on the table. My cards on the table is that, for example, you and me, we come from two different countries where a lot of us will be reduced to understanding, oh, Rabia is from Pakistan, hence it is my duty to dislike Rabia because there was a war in 1971. We don't understand the complexity. We don't understand, we don't want to look into the historical context of 1971 and also the previous. I mean, there is no doubt that what the West Pakistan did to East Pakistan was racist. It was a genocide. At least I am not doubtful about it at all. But we also don't want to see the British colonial history that essentially created this hierarchical society, right? But you and I are here now. You're a Muslim woman. I'm a Muslim man. And we are now all labeled as one South Asian. But then within the Muslim community at home, we have our experiences, difficulties. We know the stories of honor killing. We know the experiences of marginalization. We know the oppression of women. We know how the LGBT communities are, treated in Muslim communities. We can't turn our blind eye to that. So if I go back to Fannie Lou Hamer, is that nobody's free until everybody's free. When we are dealing with Islamophobia, I want to learn this from you, Rabia, and I want to think together. How do we look at different vectors of oppressions and be compassionate, kind, and also unapologetic to address many vectors simultaneously?
Yeah, I think what you've said is so true. It's the complexity of those issues that oftentimes I think the state and colonization in itself likes to divide things, divide things into neat categories, and lived experiences and life is not like that. Like, life is messy, and life is mix and match, right? Like, it's intersectional in its nature. And I think the state and really colonization, in its way of dividing things to make them into neat little packages, often what it does is that it sees everything as the same. So if we're talking about Islamophobia, there's just this one single story of what Islamophobia is and what it looks like, and it fails to see the enormity of the intersectional experiences within that. So I think as a Muslim woman, as a South Asian Pakistani Muslim woman, I have privilege, whereas, I experience Islamophobia, but because of my color and my skin, there is a level of privilege that I display and how I access the world. Whereas maybe a Black Muslim hijabi woman has those other multitudes of oppression that you're talking about: anti-racism, Islamophobia, gender. And so I think the ways in which Islamophobia is categorized in our world, just like many different things are categorized, even if it's anti-Black racism or, indigenous issues, everything is sort of like categorized and packaged in a very neat way. And I think that's the problem. I think the things are only seen as being one thing. And when we see things like that, we fail to see the people who are experiencing these things, right? So then we have theory, but we don't have people who really are experiencing those things and are sort of like the theory into practice. And I think as we work towards, creating spaces that disrupt Islamophobia, we have to bring forward diverse voices to the table. And I think that's one of the ways that we can complicate this idea of Islamophobia and what this oppression is. It's really to bring forward those narratives, because even when we think about it, there's particular narratives of Islamophobia that get centered in the media, in the conversation, whereas so everything is very politically neat, everything is very politically represented. And I think to counter that is for us, like for me personally, to learn about those various experiences within within like Islamophobia, what it means. And I think we can be allies to each other by creating space to listen. Like we will share some of those aspects, but there will also be things that we can learn. And I think that we just need to create more space to bring forward these experiences and learn from them. And when we learn from people who are experiencing things, then we can come together as a community and continue to mobilize and fight for that change.
Yeah, and the other part of the question is that, let's say that if you go into it, basically you have grown up in a Muslim household. I have grown up in a Muslim household, and we know a lot of our ways that how we try to, I would say, probably, kind of careful apologetics about a lot of the problematic, practices that we have in our own community. Let's not forget that, so my parents are in Bangladesh. So when your parents came here with you, when you're only 6 years old, your parents have experienced Canada or continues to experience Canada in one way, which is different from you. But then probably back in home, they still want to hold on to create that home that they have left,
of course,
back in Pakistan, right? So, and then wanting to keep that home, a lot of the times we do, for example, honor killing. Let's say how by any chance our perception, our homophobia, let's just say right away it is, or so how can, as members of the Muslim community, we can look at two fronts at the same time? what is outside and what is also inside. You don't have to. I'm sorry if I'm pushing you to answer
No, it's
this
good.
question.
It's
I mean,
I think
you and I are teachers, so I think thinking about these things are important.
yeah, definitely. I think you've said it so well. I think it's so true. And I think, with our parents' generation, I think there was a lot, the way that they experienced Canada was like, be grateful that you're here, kind of keep quiet, stay quiet. It's not as bad as it could be. Oh, they didn't mean that. So there was always like these making excuses for blatantly Islamophobic and racist experiences. But it's not to say that they didn't know. I think as newcomers, this is the way that they survived and coped and created space here, as settlers. So there's such an interconnectedness of us coming from somewhere else and forming, building space here. So I think, in terms of them experiencing Canada, it was and still is that, like, you kind of have to be apologetic in a way. You kind of have to try your best, strive for the best, sort of keep quiet. And I noticed that with like this generation that I'm part of, we are sort of like pushing back on that narrative where we're like, if we are here, then we deserve dignity and respect and humanity, and it's as we reflect, I think our parents did an amazing job. And I think that they were just trying to navigate this new space that never really respected them or saw them completely, So I think their methods and their ways, were just ways in which they coped, and they created space, and they tried to make sense of their own experiences while also building community in their family, building and raising children. So I understand, where they were coming from, but I noticed with my generation, we are pushing back. And I think what else I see is that we're recognizing that we're settlers here. So even though maybe it wasn't our choice to come, we have to recognize that we are on Indigenous land. And if we are to, engage in any sort of social justice and equity, we have to start with Indigenous rights, our positionality to this land as settlers, as Muslims, as whoever we are, and how we come to this work. And so, going back to your question, I think that there is an outside and inside space where, now we have had the privilege to go through the schooling system and sort of pick up this language. And I think that there is this need to then bring this language in an accessible way to people we care about and love, and in the inside of our homes as well. And, what I'm learning is that the two go hand in hand. And if to be truly committed to social justice, we need to live this life on the outside of our life, in our professional spaces or our interactions, but also in our homes. It can't be separate. It is who we are everywhere. It's who we are all the time. And so we need to have these conversations in both spaces. And I think I do see movement. And I think for me, what I've learned is that everything is interconnected. So I can't fight for Islamophobia and ignore anti-Black racism. And I think those are some struggles that we had in the inside of our homes, where we don't want to talk about those things and those experiences, and sort of not recognize that they exist. But issues and things are intersectional. And if oppression is intersectional and has the same roots, we can't separate one thing from the other. It is this big pot of everything, and we have to sort of make sense of it. And I think that's what will give us clarity in terms of moving forward.
I think, thank you so much, Rabia, for that reflection. There's a wonderful movie, it's called Mississippi Masala, where Denzel Washington, a Black man, falls in love with a South Asian, Indian young woman.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that I straddle with, and I try to understand, is the different axes that comes here together is that, for instance, in Canada or in America, or pretty much in all the English-speaking countries, the colonial world, the colonial
Mm-hmm.
centers, um, we have come here, and now this is, you may not agree with me at all. I'm saying this basically absolutely based on my personal experience engaging with communities, Bangladeshi community. I don't unfortunately understand or speak well Hindi or Urdu. I don't,
Mm-hmm.
but I wish I did. Um, in one conversation with a community leader, I have learned that there are more than 120,000 Bangladeshis only in Greater Toronto. That's a lot of people, Bangladeshi people.
Mm-hmm.
But when I see that when it comes to movements, let's whether it is Idle No More or Black Lives Matter, I don't see the number of South Asians who are here. I wish we have seen more people coming. The
Mm-hmm.
reason I say this is because you and I reap the benefit of the resistance that have been put forward by the Black and Indigenous people for over 400 years.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I have given this example, I don't know, probably 1,000 times, but I'm going to give this example once again because I'm from Bangladesh and from that part of the world, is that when Bengali Muslim men came to North America in as early as 1890, there's a wonderful book, it's called Bengali Harlem by Professor Vivek Chivar. He documents that, sorry, the Professor Vivek Bald, I'm sorry, I correct my name, Vivek Bald. Um, he documents that Bengali Muslim men were supported by Black people, indigenous people. We would not be able to exist here if Black women, indigenous women, Puerto Rican women didn't marry these Bengali Muslim men. We cannot forget that the anti-Asian, act where the Asians were blocked. We cannot forget about in 1914, the ship uh,
Mm-hmm.
Maragatu, when it came to Canadian shores in British Columbia, there was an assembly where these Indian people cannot land in Canada. Whereas, interestingly, we have fought for the British. We have died on the front
Mm-hmm.
line. When the Germans and Brits were fighting, we died on the British
Mm-hmm.
front. But
Mm-hmm.
just I don't know, 1944 is not a very long time ago. The children or the grandchildren of Nazis can now very comfortably travel to Canada, America, in London.
Mm-hmm.
But when you and I want to travel, we face a lot of restrictions, right? So,
Yes.
do you think that our parents are still holding on to this model minority myth or image where directly or indirectly they are telling us, keep your heads down, stay in the line, and display that attitude of slavish gratitude, which you just have said, is that, oh, we are fortunate that we live in Canada, and we forget that Indian subcontinent has been exploited to bones. British
Mm-hmm.
Industrial Revolution wouldn't have happened if the British colonization did not reduce Indian economy from nearly 30% to bare less than 3%.
Mm-hmm.
Winston Churchill alone devised a Bengal famine that killed 10 million Bengalis. I'm sorry, you can call me ungrateful as you want to. I couldn't give a rat's. I don't care. I am very comfortably ungrateful, very
Mm-hmm.
comfortably, in rebel rouser. But that's not the
Mm-hmm.
same in our own community. Do you think that we're still holding on to that narrative? What do we need to
Yeah.
do to be a troublemaker?
Yeah, you've said it so well, and it really stems from colonization, right? Like, um, the roots are colonization and capitalism, and I think the model minority myth is very much ingrained in our cultures and ways of being. And I think we carry that as well. Like, I'm sure I have those biases embedded within me too. And it wasn't necessarily my parents, it was the culture in itself that was present, right? It was this culture that's always there, but it's quiet, but you know it's there. And so I think that, I think that that model minority myth is still present. And I think a lot of the times we think things are just single issues. So, the model minority myth creates problems for all racialized people, not just Asians or East Asians. It pits us against each other. And I think that's the problem, is where it shows it really, I think that's colonization too, right? To pit us against each other and to focus on like our differences and, who's better than who, and in that way we get more privilege because of other people's suffering. And that's what the model minority myth really does, is that, you might be seen as this model immigrant or Canadian, but at the sake of who? It's always at the sake of somebody else. So is that the Black community or those other intersectional communities? So I think it's rooted in our cultures and ways of being, and I think it stems from capitalism and colonization to only see things as single issues. So we might assume that, like, oh, we don't have anything to do with anti-Black racism, so we're gonna just stay quiet and not say anything. We don't have anything to do with Indigenous rights because we're not Indigenous, so we're just gonna kind of like stay quiet and focus on ourselves and, being great ourselves. But I think, what's shifting, or in my experience, what I see is shifting, is this idea of interconnectedness. And, no one wins when we pit people against each other. So if there is a model minority, it's not really helping us. It's not making us, it's not really doing anything for us, because it's a racial stereotype, and it has impacts on all racialized people. And so I would hope that there is more intersectionality in our conversations, and that we recognize that our oppression is interconnected, and to really recognize our history and our stories. We wouldn't be here. Like, we are settlers. So who are we here? And whose land are we on? So, and it's all connected for me. Like, that's what I'm learning more, is this interconnectedness. And if I'm passionate about one thing, I can't forget something else, because at the end of the day, if things are not interconnected, then we're not really solving them at the roots. And so that's kind of what I'm learning myself. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, you have very adequately answered my question. And I think, there's what's that English saying, is that, you can't tame it if you can't name it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to question myself, is that if my son brings a white friend at home, somehow I feel elevated because my son has a white friend. But if my son would bring a Black friend or an Indigenous friend or an immigrant friend from Ghana, how would I feel? And I'm going to be unapologetic here once again, is that so I worked briefly to understand that how teachers are trained in Canada. So I was trying to understand how the immigrant children are quickly, particularly from the continent of Africa, let's say Somalia or Sudan, or from Syria, is that, oh, they have learning disability, or not understanding them in full context. Question. Actually, no, I think it's a good segue. Imam Bhai has asked a wonderful question. You know that Bhai means brother, right? This is our...
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Imam Bhai is a very respectable community member, and he organizes amazing talks. Is that how can we come out of this social cocoon? Can Rabia share some challenges that she faced during her growing up age?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think I would like to go back to, something that you were saying was that we have to address the things that are happening in our own cultures as well. Like our cultures are so embedded in anti-Black racism. And I think if we don't address those with our families and in everyday ways, we really can't mobilize change, right? And I think this goes back to, my own experiences growing up. I think I've always felt not totally Canadian and not always totally Pakistani. So somewhere in the middle. But then when you're in the middle, you don't know who you are as well. So there's this identity issue when you're you're almost broken up, your identity is broken up where you're not seen completely. You're not a Canadian because you're not what Canada looks like. You're not a Canadian of that stereotypical of a white presenting Canadian. And so then who are you? And I think what I'm learning is that, we have to find the middle space can be a beautiful space because it's a bridge. And that bridge can help us have perspectives from both worlds. And I think those hyphenated perspectives help us see interconnectedness, and it helps us, have a lens and a foot into both worlds. And in that way, we can sort of create some change. And so just going back to the question, a lot of my experiences are always being seen as being from somewhere else and always having to justify who you are, where are you from, when did you come here, as we were talking earlier. And never, my visible identity and body is never read as being from here. There always has to be explanation. And it's never just okay that, oh yeah, you're Canadian too, just like someone else. And so I think, navigating those things are very important to me. And I think now as an educator with a lot of positional power to create change in my own classroom, that positional power is something that I'm very aware of, because it's not necessarily power that I have in other places in the world because of how my body is read. But recently, what I've sort of been thinking about is that this positional power is very situational. Because it's really based on the situations that I'm in where I have this positional power. So in the classroom, I have positional power in the ways in which I teach curriculum, right? But outside, maybe in the staff room, I don't have that power anymore, because then once again, my body is not seen as a teacher body, not seen as a Canadian body. And so, I think being very aware of my own experiences and my own identities and how I come to this work is something that I'm striving to learn a lot more, because I think it helps in the ways in which I teach and, see the students in front of me. So I guess just to add, I think that there are always challenges, and it's exhausting to carry this weight. And I think that's one of the biggest challenge is, now that there is some positional power, there is this urgency to create change, whether that's just in my own, the access that I have in my classroom or my local community. But it's you're trying to make that change in your classroom, but you're also going through these experiences daily. So you're always navigating you're navigating your own experiences of racism, discrimination, and you're also trying to create a better space for your students. And the merging of that is exhausting, to constantly have to fight for your dignity, humanity, in almost every single space in your life. I think that's what is exhausting. It's exhausting carrying this weight, but at the same time, it's also something that's a privilege, and it's a blessing to have this space to make sense of these experiences and to have this language, which is really a privilege to then even try to create any change.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I often tell myself, I go back to her work. Um, well, I mean, if you research her, you'll find that she will be known in the context of country. She's a British American writer, Tai Selassie. She has a very powerful idea that really helps. Is that don't ask me where I'm from. Tell me where I'm. Basically, she talks about the idea of local, where I'm local, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I was born in a village in Bangladesh, but if you ask me, is that like I have been in academia, I've been a teacher for over 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the place where I was born, there are so many things in me which perhaps will be remarkably different and similar to you being an educator in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So she talks about what's right, what's restricted, what's the ritual of certain ways, right? For instance, um, you probably don't face it, but when I speak to a lot of people who don't speak English every day, a lot of the times when they'll speak to you, they'll probably not ask your pronoun, or they'll probably say, "Oh, I have talked to Rabia, and he said that." So the question is, instead of understanding or
Mm-hmm.
getting frustrated or angry, like, "Oh, how did you? Why?" And the question is
Mm-hmm.
that where does that person is embedded? You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've noticed something very funny recently. Is that so? Sometimes when I go to walk my dog, we have seen that asking like, so what's his name?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I know this is a very naive and very probably rather
Mm-hmm.
silly example, but the question is that why do we ask that question? What's his name
Yeah.
or what's her name, right? Um, so
Mm-hmm.
this is true. Now we have a very good question, and I think a very good segue is thank you, Poonam, for this question. Is that how can we practice social justice education at the elementary school? I mean, parents might say that ideas like patriarchy, capitalism, um, uh,
Mm-hmm.
social hierarchy, structural inequality, like these are very difficult words. I don't know how the hell to talk about intersectional feminism. I don't know. I mean, when I teach students in our village and I meet them regularly, is that I don't know. I talk about a lot of feminist issues without using the word intersectional feminism or black radical feminism. You're a teacher. We're a teacher. So how do you talk about these things in elementary school? And thank you for this question. Thank you very much. It's a very beautiful question.
Yeah, that's a lovely question. Thank you so much. I think I think social justice at the elementary level is foundational and it's very important. And so then the conversation and your question is really how do we do this work? Theory is great, but how do we do this work with kindergarten, grade 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 10-year-olds? And I think this is really important. And so some of the ways that I do this work is one, to recognize that children are not neutral beings, that, that there is this myth of children as being innocent. And I don't mean like innocent. What I mean is that there is this view that, these ideas and these topics can wait until children are older, and that we shouldn't be like filling their ears with this stuff. But I think we have to disrupt that idea, because our children are very much part of this world. They have their own lived experiences based on oppression, privilege. They might not know those words, but they have their own experiences. If they don't have their own experiences, they are aware of what's happening in the world, what's unfair and what's fair and what's unfair. And I think when we disrupt this idea that children are neutral and that they're innocent, we can then have these conversations with our children, and those children who might be seeing things that are happening in the world, with a trusted adult, they can really make sense of their experiences in a very relevant, responsive way. That's a safe way as well, because we want to teach our children all of these things, but we have to be responsive and we have to see where they're at, once we know where they're at, then we can scaffold our conversations and help them make sense and meaning of their own experiences, or the experiences of others. And it really starts with us ourselves, within us, disrupting this idea that, you know, these conversations are not for these kids. And I think another way that I try to engage in this work is by seeing that the teacher is not neutral, and that education is political. You know, I hear a lot that, you know, I'm not political, education is not political. But whether we know it or not, education is not neutral. We're always bringing something to it. And if we can recognize that everything is political, then we can work towards creating spaces that are inclusive and that will promote that critical consciousness. So really has to do with a lot of teacher identity and teacher pedagogy, thinking about that we're not neutral. And I think, you know, it's not just educators, it's parents, it's family, caregivers. You know, we're not neutral beings because we're in this world, and we always carry something that is political, whether we know it or not. And so it's very important to know our own views and our own, you know, biases and, you know, our own views of children. So I think those might be more pedagogical things, but they're really important. And I think another way that I try to engage in this work at the elementary level is really through resources, and thinking critically about which resources are always centered, but also how we can use books and resources to springboard a lot of these conversations, to provide accessibility to these conversations, and really teach children the language. You know, if we want them to create change, they have to start building up those foundational language pieces. And I think through books, we can be very responsive and reflective, and engaging at a very age-appropriate level. So like, this work is important and it has to be age-appropriate. And I think, you know, one of the other ways that we do this work is really helping children become conscious and aware. And in following all of those different things, I think it really helps them become critically conscious members of their communities. So I'll give an example, if that's okay. In my role as a teacher librarian in a school, a few years ago, I partnered with a grade 1 class, and we wanted to sort of teach our children, and most of these children were white, their identity was white, they were socioeconomically affluent. And so me as a teacher in this space, I looked different from all of the other teachers. So that was like an interesting thing too, to think about what a teacher is supposed to look like. And so that was a thing. But when we were partnering with the grade 1 class through the library, we wanted our children to, you know, think critically about a social issue. And so what we did was we thought critically about a social issue, but we really wanted them to think critically about community helpers, which is a big theme in grade 1, of like, you know, the different people who help out in a community. A lot of the times in this community, it's always like police officers that are sort of like honored and like glorified. And so what we did was intentionally, through our choices of books, we brought forward like community helpers that were different, and or different from their experience or what they were exposed to. And one of the people that we came across was Aliyah Baker, who was a librarian in Basra, Iraq. And so, you know, we learned her story. She saved like 30,000 books because her library, which was a hub of a community and it was like a meeting place, was going to be destroyed because of the war in Iraq. And so we thought about, like, this is a community helper. This is a Muslim woman who's wearing a hijab, very different from the exposure the children had. And so intentionally we chose this community helper, and, you know, we read the story, we looked at maps of Iraq, we looked at maps of Canada, Toronto, to situate our work. We thought about, well, if this was our experience, which book would we save, how would we feel. So really making that experience relevant for our students. And then what ended up happening was that her library was destroyed because of the war. And so what children did was they thought about the issues and the reasons and the feelings associated with how that library was a hub for the community. It was destroyed. But what they did was an action piece was to create a new library for her. At first they designed it, then they built it with like wood and, all of that stuff. So I think all of that was possible because I think, we recognize that children are capable of deep thinking. We intentionally chose a hero or a community helper that was different from their lived experience. They explored the issue by connecting to their own life, but also learning from a country that was different from their experience. And to sort of consolidate the learning, they took an action. So I think, when we think about social justice education and helping our youngest children learn about it, it has to be action-based. Because I think children need to know that if they see something that's unfair, if that there's an injustice that's unfair, they can always do something to make an impact. And I think that's some of the ways that intentionally we can use the curriculum to expand the ideas of our students and our children.
That's a beautiful example, Rabia. I also wanted to add that why children need to be taught social justice education, I don't know, probably from kindergarten. So I think one of these evidence that anybody can look up and should, I request our audience and ourselves to look it up, is Dr. Mamie and Dr. Kenneth Clark in 1940s. This is 2021. The Brown versus Board famous landmark case in the United States, where children as young as 3 years old were given just a black doll and a white doll. Nothing else, nothing about the doll, just a black doll, just a white doll. And the children, babies, as young as 3 years old, are told, which doll do you think is better, the black doll or the white doll? Obviously, till today, this experiment continues to be happening. Imagine, it started in 1940, today is 2021. It continues to be reproduced and replicated. And not a single place so far it has shown that the preference of black doll outweighs the preference of white doll. But what is really heartbreaking? I think this study was done at Howard University, historically a very prominent Black university in America, is that obviously the white kids were picking white doll. The black kids, one particular black girl, it's a video that research done. She picks a white girl. And she says that, I think this is a good doll. And another black boy, very young kid, says that, I think, he's good because he's white. Mm-hmm. So if kids as young as 3 years old can have an acute perception of race, I don't know, who are we kidding? But also, I think it's very convenient to say, oh, these things are very complex and complicated. We should not teach them elementary school. Well, if we don't teach them elementary school, who does it benefit?
And when will we do the work, right?
Yeah. I usually say to my students, I give a very silly example. I say that, look, our computer has lots of software. You install a software and uninstall a software. When we start, the first thing we start talking about, let's see what are the softwares we need to uninstall. That is operating within you. Is that, I don't know, once one of my black students at university said to me, is that a black, female student, she said to me that, look, I met a lot of my friends who don't know they're white, but I've not met a single black student who does not know she's black. Now this, just think about it.
That's enormous. I think as I hear you talk, I think, children already are aware, whether they know it or not, of these things that are happening in the world. They know what's desirable through, media, who's represented, which lifestyle is represented. It's often the white lifestyle. And internally, because of a lack of representation of diverse experiences in a very everyday way, we think that white is what we have to strive towards. White is good. White is norm, and white is where we need to strive towards. And I think that is something that, is visible as soon as children are conscious and they are aware of these messages, that they're constantly always given. And I think just hearing you talk, I think it's so important that social justice education and talk is normalized and part of our everyday. So, in my elementary class this year, we really looked at identity and we looked at like skin colors. So, it seems tokenistic, but something as simple as having skin colored crayons that represent the children in our class was fundamental. It's foundational to be able to recognize and see and represent it, see that, oh yeah, this is me, I can finish my picture. So having these big words like identity, power, and privilege, but really making it accessible for children, like age appropriate. It's not to water down the work at all, but I think it's to build and scaffold, right? I think that there's a difference between watering down. I think what we can do is really set the foundations and really build up to it. So whether that's like a unit on identity in the elementary classroom where we think about, we do self-portraits and we think about representing all parts of ourselves, but then we have tools like crayons that show that we matter, that our color matters, and that our color is part of who we are. And so, self-portraits, family portraits, and honoring all types of families and having them displayed and creating relationships with them. Talking about how, some of my students were saying that they wished this year, they wish that they have more English names, Englishier names, because people are having a hard time pronouncing their names. So, finding relevant books and texts to speak to their experiences that affirm what they're going through, but also expands their experiences. I think all of those things can be done in an intentional way in the elementary classroom, and we just have to be conscious, intentional, and critical in our choices.
Thank you, Rabia. I want to switch gear and try to go into something even a harder conversation. We know that education has always been and is an integral part of colonization, colonialism, psychic colonization. We know remarkable scholars like Frantz Fanon wore black skin, white masks. That, at least being an educator from Bangladesh, I know that the Indian Viceroy Macaulay was a visionary. In 1834, he wanted to create a new breed of Indians who are brown in their skin but British in their mind. I have taught in schools where the curriculum comes from Cambridge University. My students, direct students, obviously I also have taught, I continue to teach in other students in other part of the society in Bangladesh, is that how our students, they did not know their history, own culture, but they knew about Queen Elizabeth, they knew about Richard the Lionheart. And I see this striking similarity in Canada, that how Canada's project, the colonizers' project of kill the Indian in the indigenous children. And the recent event when hundreds and hundreds and unmarked graves are coming. I mean, I heard a spoken word where somebody said very powerfully is that as if their bones, even in their bodies, even from underneath the ground, the children, they wanted us to learn about the colonial cruelty, right? So Justice Sinclair in Canada said that residential school was essentially a cultural genocide. So I want you and me to focus on this 3 points: is that psychic colonization, cultural genocide, literally wiping out history, heritage, and root of one community, and then bringing it just to a very notable, remarkable Black educator that I absolutely admire, Henry John Clark. One of the things that he said and taught African Americans in America is that the most despicable brutality, one of the most despicable brutalities of colonization and slavery was that erasing the history, roots, and heritage of the Black people. Because if you can do that, if I can make you forget your language, your root, your culture, where you come from, that is the ultimate form of engineering of psychic colonization, internalizing inferiority, what have you. So you being an educator, to what extent do you think that we have been able to decolonize our teaching practices? To what extent do you think that we are forever mindful of those issues?
Yeah, I think education has always been used to decolonize. Like, it was a tool to decolonize, right? What matters, who's centered, who's left out, who's included when, in terms of additive approaches. So I think, education has always been used as a vehicle to colonize, sorry. But I think it can also be used to decolonize. And I think in terms of Indigenous stories and histories, as an educator, if I want to do this work, I really have to know the history of this land first myself. I need to learn the history so that I can learn the truth. Oftentimes colonization is about making things into categories so that we don't know the truth, and it's all about like cutting things up and hiding and erasing truths, and that's really been so fundamental to colonization. And so I think even though education has been used as a tool for that, I think it can also be used. It's one of the greatest tools that can be used to decolonize us as well, because it's really, if we focus on, helping educators learn the truth and the history of this land, then we can then, bring this truth to our children and in elementary school and middle school and in all spaces. But we can't really do that if we don't know the truth and if we don't see things as interconnected. So even though it has been a tool that's been used, I think it is one of our most powerful tools. Maybe as a visionary myself, I think if we are going to create inclusion or ways forward that are more equitable, education is one of the ways to do that. It is a tool to then decolonize ourselves first so that we can learn and then bring this truth to our children. So I think it plays a pivotal role in the future that we want to create.
I just want to take a comment that's very relevant. Shamina Frashumi, thank you very much. That in Bangladesh, English medium students learn about winter, picturing them with snowman snow, not our beautiful foggy winter. This is so accurate. Thank you so much, Shumi. And this other one, the literature teaches them rough behavior with parents. I mean, this is particularly very interesting, and Bengali scholars have written about it, is that in Bangladesh, obviously pretty much any colonial countries, former countries with colonial history, in India is the same, in Pakistan I don't think is very different, is that, do you think that you have experienced when you have gone to visit Pakistan and you speak English with probably Canadian style English? I don't want to say even Canadian accent. I particularly feel, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be even apologetic about it. I literally feel disgusted by it. Is that, oh, that's a beautiful British accent. That's a beautiful Canadian accent. What the hell is that? But do you think you have experience? You have gone to Pakistan to visit, and you're like, oh, Rabia, your English is awesome. You're not like, please speak to that.
To answer that question, I really have to speak about my teaching assignment this year. I was teaching English as a second language. So we are teaching children who are like newcomers, new Canadians. And, as a student who also went through this program myself, now having, gone through the system, there are comments like, from parents or other people, like, oh, your English is so good, and I think I always feel really like grossed out at that, because I think it's so it's a contextual term, and it's not really a compliment. It's not really a compliment, and I think speaking back to it, this program, English as a Second Language, has sort of been used in the past as a way to introduce children to Canadian life, whatever that means. And, going through this program myself as a child, coming out of it, I felt like I had to give up parts of myself, parts of my identities, to be really seen as Canadian. And so I think, this year, in terms of like decolonizing every program, when I got this as teaching assignment, I was really thinking about how to create spaces for my students who are coming from all over the world to help them, learn English, but also to honor their languages, their identities, and lived experiences. And I think, I think that is just as important, thinking about like children are bringing assets. Oftentimes it's like, you have to learn English, and you can kind of speak your language at home. But I think it's very important when we're talking about, English, and who speaks great English and who speaks English that's desirable, and which English accent, whatever that means, has capital in our space. I think all of those are colonization tools. And I think to work with children, we have to create spaces where we are recognizing that, multilingualism is part of our world. And yes, our children in our schools and spaces will learn English, but what's almost more important is for them to center, when they come, it's almost more important to center their lived experience, their language, and their cultures. And I think there has to be that shift when we consider English and who speaks English well, and the desirability of English.
I want to take some more comments. Thank you so much, Rabia, to speak to that. Thank you, Shumi. These are very, and I'm being a teacher, I mean, this just is. This one where she's saying that rather than exporting a rich educational model of subcontinent, we here in Bangladesh are importing inappropriate educational model. I mean, oh my God, in Bangladesh, I remember that as a teacher, there were policies where we would punish our students if they spoke in Bangla. You have come to an English medium school, you are supposed to speak in English. And again, I'm not trying to demean or humiliate parents. I mean, parents have learned very well that English language has a purchase. I mean, I have escaped out of poverty by learning English. I watched English learning, watching TV. So one of the things that I say that, yes, I mean, I have been also very actively involved in education for the marginalized kids. So when I was working in the largest private British school in Bangladesh, I was also working with the street kids. And Rabia, I'm not joking. I used to believe that the way I have escaped poverty, brought my family out of poverty by learning English, by excelling in it. I was, I don't know, fanatic in promoting English in my family, that, if you go to my house, we still live in village, you will see that pretty much everybody speaks English. But then I had to decolonize. I have seen that how kids from villages, from streets, learning English, all of a sudden they suffer from some kind of complexity about their own identity. When what happens that everything white is right, everything West is the best. And it has happened. It has happened in my own loved ones. And then now when I teach the kids in the villages of Bangladesh, you have to learn English because English is the language of economy. First, I talk extensively about the psychic implications of learning English. And I speak to my fellow friends in academia, particularly, look, I'm a doctoral student. I have done graduate studies for a long time. I do write in complex I'm sorry, sometimes it literally feels stupid, writing in complex, dense, difficult language. I find it pretentious. I find it, there are gatekeepers. If I don't write in that particular language, and you have done your master's, you know that, and you have to appear educated. So I have friends, who sometimes write in that language. I say that, can you please take yourself a little bit less seriously? Okay, sometimes you write for academic papers. I get it. You have to. But other times, I want to write like, I don't know, James Baldwin. I want to, write like Toni Morrison. They talked about incredibly difficult things, but other than using all that stupid, colonial, academic, philosophical, sociological, anthropological language, enough of that. So, so because of that, when I go to village, I talk about dressing. I talk about, the so-called proper Bangla that is in books, textbooks, right? This is the language. So I talk about language's implication on our mind. Have you noticed, Rabia, that in CBC or in all the television channels you have in Canada, I have seen people who can visibly, you can understand, they're from Australia, or they're from New Zealand, they're from Britain. I have not seen one person who is a journalist in these television channels who is newscasting. You can say this person is from Pakistan or India or from Bangladesh. I don't think so. I have seen in social gathering that if somebody speaks in, I don't know, in British accent, oh, that is so exquisite, proper, upper British accent. If somebody speaks with French accent English, oof, this is so exotic. But the moment you understand somebody speaks in very, South Asian way, that becomes desi. That becomes, humiliating. That becomes ways of putting somebody. I've been told at times that, when I get very serious, I say one or two words that sounds British. I said that I don't know what the hell does it mean. Because anything I speak is essentially learning how to speak in another tone. I have trained myself hundreds and thousands of hours in Bangladesh when I was, because I knew that if I could speak English in in American accent, it has cultural purchase. But now I'm speaking unapologetically because, well, I have, crossed the academic line of 20 years. And, but I say to the students in village that your language, the dialect that you speak of your village, that is the most precious thing. I mean, when I speak to my mother, I speak in the dialect of our village, and I will hold on to that as long as I live. And I ask my son not to forget that dialect. So, I mean, language, it's incredibly political. And if you go to Bangladesh and if you lived long enough in Pakistan, I am sure you would understand. I mean, I'm sure you see it in here as well. So, that needs to be, decolonized. Now, I ask you another question, which is, again, very troubling and also very difficult. Do you think when it comes to colonization and education and understanding that how this internalization of inferiority happens, do you think that we are paying enough attention that how media is shaping the perception of our children? And are we doing enough to disrupt it? If not, how can we disrupt it?
Yeah, what you've said is so beautiful, just listening to you reflect on that and recognize the importance of language and how it plays into us knowing ourselves, It's very important. And it's definitely one of the things that, I'm reflecting a lot more on now, being an educator and just, recognizing and being more aware. I think definitely media has a role to play in terms of perpetuating particular norms and lived experiences. I think particular identities are always represented as being normal. They're always represented as being normal. And so then if you're not represented in everyday ways, what is the consequence of that? And I think we have to do a better job of centering and bringing forward diverse lived experiences in everyday ways. That's really one of the ways to counter, because what we see in the media really shows us if we belong or if we don't. And if we always see that we're not belonging, it's going to have like an impact on our psyche and in what we think belonging means or what we need to strive towards.
Now, in terms of, I'll just take a quick comment, which it makes very, in terms of punishing students for speaking their language. The same happens in India. And I think that one thing that we all should, if it were up to me, I would make it like a world event, is that how indigenous children were tortured, oppressed, murdered in the residential schools in Canada. And I think I sometimes say probably sounds very funny. I say that in the face of these odds, to be able to have the courage to speak your language is a revolutionary act. Speak your language unapologetically, and holding on to that. So, in a residential school, this is the evidence that it has happened. Humaira, thank you very much that I grew up with that on my face. Speaking English was the priority at home and felt more educated. I mean, hats off to you for recognizing that. And I hope that your families and loved ones, they understand it, that, they follow it. Oh my God. Shumi, you're making my day today. Thank you so much. Is that parents here are proud that their children fail in Bangla. I am not kidding. I have had parents, again, being an educator, who would come and say, well, again, I'm not blaming those parents. I'm not saying that, they don't love their kids. I think it's just a matter of thinking, is that they'll come and tell you that, well, my son doesn't know how to speak in Bangla, but, I have 5 garments factories. The laborers in the garment factories, they don't speak in English. So, they have to speak in Bangla. I wish, they didn't say it, but I'm extending. And when I'm sitting there, I used to have very severe identity crisis teaching in this private elite English medium schools, but now I don't. I used to feel like that my students need my skill as an economics teacher who is well versed in English, who can train students in debate. So you need my skill and you will appreciate it. And I know a lot of my students are hearing this and they'll be hearing this now, in future, But I used to always feel that, inferiority complex that, okay, if you know that I'm from a village, if you know that my father is a farmer, if you know that I'm the first one in my family has gone to university, I used to have that terror in me, is that, oh my God, don't see me that I come from a village. But now it's like, I tell the stories unapologetically to the students in village, saying that I've gone through this. And, this is, so Shumi, thank you so much for that reflection. This is incredibly important. So the other thing that I wanted to ask you is, in Canadian context right now, what do you think is some of the biggest barriers in social justice education? What do you think, a two-parts question, what do you think is actually blocking? These are the most biggest blocks, from, social justice education in the schools in Canada.
That is a really good question. I think it's some of the things that we've talked about, where there's this idea that children are neutral and that, we shouldn't be having these conversations with them. This is for adults. So I think that, in my experience, that is a very big barrier, that these conversations are not for children or are not for children right now. I think it's also this idea that, teachers are neutral. And I think another thing that I'm really seeing as a barrier is like thinking that like if we talk about something, then our children are going to become racist or something. If we talk about skin color, then we're creating a place for them to then bully someone else, or then as if talking about it is going to create the action. So I feel like there's a lot of like beating around the bushes in a way, which what I mean is that we try to avoid the topic, and we'll try to like skirt around it so that we don't have to talk about it because it's uncomfortable. I think, in elementary school, what I also see in a Canadian context is this overwhelming concept of kindness. and not critical kindness, just, let's all be kind to each other. We're all the same. We don't have to really think about skin color because that's going to be focused on our differences. So an overwhelmingness of kindness, and just, we just have to be kind to each other. That's what's going to fix the world. And I think that guise of kindness doesn't take into consideration the systemic issues. We need individual as well as systemic issues to create change. And I think overwhelmingly this idea and concept of kindness is very surface level approach. That's very common. And I think it goes hand in hand with overwhelmingly focusing on our similarities in the elementary classroom. And I think it's beautiful to talk about our similarities, but we should also be okay, and we should also make it normal to talk about our differences. And I think from my own experiences, I think that there is a lot of hesitancy to do this work because it's uncomfortable and it's messy. So I think it really goes back to the concept of childhood, of children, of education. Those are like those bigger things. And I think that they come out in these different ways. What I also think is that a lot of educators will say, I don't see color, because they don't want to point at people's differences. But I say, if you don't see color, then you don't see the child completely, and you don't see their complete experiences. And so you don't see all of them. And so if you don't see all parts of your students and your children, how can we teach our children if we don't see all of them? So I think, I think those are some of the biggest barriers and issues. And I think a lot of our work in elementary school, especially in a Canadian context, is very additive approaches. And I think that's a tool of colonization, is to make things into neat categories and not see the interconnections between cultures, people, ways of life. It's very much packaged. I think that's one of the problems where we'll talk about Islamic history in October, we'll talk about Black history in February. And I think those are okay places to maybe start, but they can't be where we stay or end up, I think those are some very big issues in social justice and, the way that it's delivered. I think one other is that in the Canadian context, it's very much needing a checklist to do this work. Give me a social justice checklist and I'll check it off. I've done this, this, and this. And so I think the enormity of it, I think we get bogged down by the theory. And so we need to see more that, social justice is not a checklist. It's a framework, and this framework will look different in different settings. The framework gives us space to know some of the main things that we should be focused on or we should be looking at, but it's not a checklist. It's a framework, and we need to make this framework responsive, relevant to the children who are in front of us. And so I think all of those things are some of the barriers to how social justice is done, whether that's in Canada or maybe even globally. And I think to sort of disrupt those things is kind of what we've been having a conversation about, is to recognize children's role in social justice movements, is to recognize that me as an educator, I am political. School itself is a colonial state and it is political. And so where are the spaces where I can make disruptions, whether that's critically delivering the curriculum, whether that's recognizing that equity and social justice will look different in different contexts, whether that's making authentic relationships with families. I think all of those ways are really how we can bring social justice theory to practice and to get over some of those barriers.
Thank you so much, Rabia. I'm going to give you some concrete examples here. As probably, if I haven't mentioned this to you already, but I'm saying this again now, is that we use these conversations to promote critical consciousness among students in Bangladesh and in different places. So this video will be watched and rewatched. So I want this to be in the reference. so that our students, they can use it subsequently. So there is a very prominent and very noticeable, remarkable American educator named Jane Elliott. So one of the things when you talked about kindness, especially Canadian kindness, you see, it's so deceptive in Canadian context. Like, we have ideas about Canada. It's a mosaic society. You're not in America. You have to forget your identity. If you're in America, it's a melting pot. But here you can maintain yourself, your identity, your culture, right? So what happens that this performative politeness and calculated kindness, what it does not expose the underlying structural inequality. Diversity is not about eating your damn samosa in one day. Diversity is not about, let's get along with each other. And the, colorblind discourse, liberal, very, very white liberal, social justice discourses. Recently, I heard a white woman saying something. I yet have to process it. I don't know how to feel about it, but my gut feeling says that there's some truth to it. So a white woman is saying is that white women are one of the biggest reasons why white supremacy continues to exist. Because when white men grow up in their households and when mothers have significant amount of influence on their children, I'm not saying that's unique and same in every family, but in a lot of the family, at that time, the white mothers that teach, well, just get along, be kind, be nice, etc., right? Just be nice and everything is going to be fine, right? They don't talk about the structural issues, the hard issues, and it is data, it's evidence. It's not, Firoz's crazy rant. Is that white women are way more privileged than men of color. So, I mean, this is again, I'm looking at it intersectionally, right? So Jane Elliott, after the, brutal murder of Martin Luther King, she took a lifelong, vow to teach social justice, racial justice in classes. She used to differentiate classes based on their eye color. Oh, you have brown eyes and you have black eyes. And based on the eye color, you are talented and brilliant. In Elliott's class, white students could not take 10 minutes of discrimination. You Google Jane Elliott's training, you will find out that white students crying and leaving the classroom that, oh, you can't be so kind to me. I have seen white women crying in high school teachers meeting here is that I just don't want I don't want my children to learn critical race theory. And just because I don't want the critical race theory to be taught, I'm not a racist, damn it. So that's a white woman's cry, right? And I'm very scared of white women's tears. I mean, I'm going to tell you. Because, white women's tears, the system knows the power because the system is essentially white. And the white women know that their tears are powerful because their tears can mobilize the entire goddamn system to protect them, to defend them. You want the evidence? Go look it up. Is that how the white women have been portrayed to be fragile and, their fragility? I have seen it working working in the universities in Canada. Can you imagine that teaching at the university level, the brutal murder of Rina Virk in British Columbia? So there's a paper, sociological paper. I have seen white female professors at the university level thinking, oh, no. This murder of an Indian high school girl, a sociology paper on that, is too harsh on the white minds, fragile minds. This is, by the way, a predominantly white university. Do you see what I mean? I just want to take a comment of Shruti Sharath. This will just hit the point home. One of my white woman students, in not a very subtle way, mentioned, how can I comment on her writing and English in an assignment grading? Funny thing, I never mentioned about grammar or writing or English in my feedback, just on their content. She got upset, she got a B and immediately lashed at me as I am occupying space of grading when I'm not supposed to be grading, supposed to being a TA of color with English as my second language. I'm going through this bizarre experience till the end of my course now. Oh my God, Shruti, my friend, I don't know wherever you are right now. At one point, when I came to Canada first, I started telling my students clearly that I want you to know my name, My name is Firoz, and I come from Bangladesh. We have been clothing you for 300 years. If you don't know my name, I'm going to cut your marks. And I'm unapologetic about it, even when I teach now. Whether, no, I'm not going to be. I'm not going to be. And, some of my white students feel, obviously, very. And Shruti, I couldn't agree more with you that, how that feels. And another comment of Shruti, you just made my day. My town has a set of mothers and parents called Aurora Black Community, and we support each other in incidents of racism and hate crimes. This is wonderful. And Shruti, can I get in touch with you afterwards? I really want to know more about it, and then I want to bring this forward. Thank you so much for bringing this. So true. Ms. Khokhar, color blindness doesn't work. It's important to recognize race, ethnicity, child, and social location. So, that politeness doesn't help. And Rabia, I am so happy is that, you do this work and speak unapologetically. And I think that, thank you, Shumi. Yes, Jen Elliott. Yes, Jen Elliott. So when they cannot take few minutes of workshop, imagine what Black and Indigenous and people of color go through experiencing it their whole damn day, for whole damn life. I meditate myself, and to keep myself calm and to keep my sanity. But a lot of the times when I hear from white people, just be kind. Let's get along with each other.
Mm-hmm. It's frustrating.
Sorry, I went on a rant, but I couldn't help myself.
No, I think you said it so perfectly. We carry these experiences with us constantly, and to then be in a place where the individual and the systemic is not seen is quite problematic. Like, to create change, we have to be kind. That is, we have to be kind. We have to think about our individual actions, but they have to be in connection with the systemic, there. And I think, I think a lot of the times, this idea and this concept of kindness and multiculturalism fails to critically see people's experiences beyond the cultures and the food and what you were saying, and it fails to see people's experiences completely, the good experiences, the bad experiences, the hard experiences, because it only sees people in one way. So it doesn't have space for all of us, or like all parts of us, to show up, right? And I think it's very important that we have kind children, that we're of course teaching kindness, but we also have to teach critical consciousness, and critical consciousness will look different in different grades. In kindergarten, when children are 4 or 5, it's going to look different, but it's still there. In grade 3, it will look different. So I think it's a progression. And if we start at the elementary level, we can ensure that those foundations are set. It's a process. It's going to be messy, but if we commit to it and we create community with ourselves, then we can do this work and, reflect. And I think, just talking to you today, I feel like less alone in my experiences. And I think that shows me the importance of interconnectedness and solidarity, and creating these groups and spaces where we can be ourselves completely, where we can talk about our experiences but also support each other, because this work can often feel isolating. You can often feel alone, but when we create these spaces that are intercultural, interreligious, or intersectional, that's where the power is, because that's where, when we as a community can come together and really mobilize and support each other. That's one of the things that, going back to our previous experiences, when our parents came here, they were oftentimes isolated. So the only way to do this work or to live was to follow the rules, whatever that means. And I think we owe it to the people who love us and have loved us to um, like be connected to each other, all types of different people. Like, we have to come together and be connected with each other so that we can fight for everyone's dignity and humanity. This is work that's best done in and with community. This is what I'm learning as well, to pay homage and respect to the experiences of my parents, to make sense of my own experiences that are different now, and to then mobilize those spaces, those experiences being both, right? Like those hyphenated identities, and to create something better, in our positions of power now, whatever that looks like, whether that's situational or.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about love, I want to also add the point is that, how the curriculum teaches love is depoliticized love. Symbolic, I don't know, I mean, in expressing, showing symbolic, and I'm very worried and concerned about performative politeness, performative allyship, where what happens, people of privileged positions, they come into spaces where marginalized people are expressing their concerns. What happens, I have seen, I'll give you a very naive example without pointing finger at any specific person, is that let's say that I am the CEO of a company and you are raising your concerns about workers' right, and then I stand next to you and say, Rabia, yes, I completely hear you. I don't want you to just hear me. Reallocate resources. So what happens in these spaces, I am seeing a lot of the times, is that people who are benefiting from the structure that is systemic. And I don't know if you've heard this. I hear this all the time, particularly from white friends, white classmates and white neighbors, is that, well, the colonization, it happened a long time ago. I didn't have anything to do with it. My ancestors, what can I do about it, right? And but if you then tell them, well, okay, your ancestors did it, but are you benefiting from the same structure today? Today, when your son walks on the street or your daughter walks on the street, does your daughter have to worry that a man in a black truck will run over your daughters, because your daughter? But if my daughter walks on the street wearing a hijab, she can be killed in Canada. So and this is what I think. Do hell with politeness. Do hell with politeness. And this is why I love this Egyptian feminist. She is deliberately very impolite. She will use very offensive language, and I see that politeness has a very a severe cost. And I've heard another immigrant man is saying about Canadian politeness and American kindness, is that in America you will see that a lot of the times they will come across as impolite, but they're political. But what happens in Canada is that our politeness, like, look at Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, during Canada Day, when, all these graves are being found, not found, like, they have been reported. The last Indigenous residential school closed in 1996. Imagine how recent. And, when he holds a space and says, well, this is the time to reflect, it's so goddamn performative. Indigenous people still to their right at this moment in the reserves don't have safe drinking water. For God's sake, it's their land. And you are telling that, okay, we have to be kind and we have to be mindful to bring our, how do you relate to that, Rabia? How do you calm your heart and stay on the path and, so that, like, okay, I will continue to hold the space? How do you do that?
Yeah, honestly, thank you so much for saying that. You've said that so eloquently, and I think you voiced a lot of our beliefs and our experiences. I think performative allyship is really in these days, because I think equity and social justice conversation is sort of in, like, whatever that means, right? I feel that there is a lot of performative allyship, and I think to really disrupt that and to move beyond performative allyship is to really to like listen to the voices of, you know, people who are experiencing this, but listen, not to respond necessarily. You know, oftentimes we listen to somebody, but we're like, but no, it's not really like that, or no, that's not really what your experience was. So I think we have to wholeheartedly listen, not to respond, but just to listen, to learn, to give space. We also have to learn. I think a lot of performative allyship puts onus on our bodies to teach, to do the work, or, you know, to get ideas from us. And I think as racialized people, we should give as much as we want. So if we feel comfortable sharing a resource, that's our own choice. And, you know, it's something that we're passionate about and we want to do it, so we can do it. But it shouldn't solely rest on our shoulders to teach, you know. And I think as much as we might be creating space to have this dialogue, if people want to be true allies, I think we can't be the only ones that they're like coming to learn. Like, you have to engage in your own learning. Like, you know, for example, you know, I strive to be an ally with Indigenous communities. And so my work is listening to the stories and, you know, the things that are happening. And it's also to learn. And maybe my action is to pick up a book and learn about the history and the truth. You know, I'm doing my own work to learn, and I'm not just like going into my friend list and seeing, wait, who is Indigenous or Indigenous presenting? And even that's like an issue, right? Because it's so based on what is a person supposed to look like. So, you know, listening, learning, taking the initiative and the onus to learn yourself is very important. Put that responsibility on yourself and not other people to teach you. And I think acting, I think those are the cornerstones of being an ally. Like, you know, performative allyship is very much based on statuses and tweets and writing beautiful things. And I think that's important. Like, you know, I use Twitter and I will write things. And I think it's important to have all of those mediums to talk and to share, but we have to also act in different ways. And I think based on our positionality, our positional power, we can act in different ways. So for me, acting to, you know, engage in social justice is oftentimes thinking critically about myself and how I come to this work. I also act in terms of, you know, thinking about curriculum and who's centered, and, you know, how I can bring resources that will provide a holistic experience or perspective. And so, you know, I think performative allyship is something that's very much present in our spaces. And I think we have to we might all be accused of doing some form of performative allyship. Like, I'm sure I've engaged in performative allyship. But, you know, we need to move beyond it. We can't stay there. It's urgent that we move beyond it. And one of the ways that we can move beyond it is our actions, what our actions will show. So that's some of the ways that I think about allyship. And sorry, your other question of how do I just stay committed to this work? I have to say it is hard. Carrying the weight of racism and, you know, discrimination on your shoulders is hard. But what I feel helps me is to sort of just create resources, or I think it's to create space to share my voice, because for so long we have been silenced and the structures in place have silenced us. And I think we are creating a room on tables, or we're creating new tables where people like us never existed, or our voice was never valued. So I think one of the ways is now to use this, you know, positional power or platform or whatever I have, is to, you know, speak, because for so long we've been silent, speak about my experiences. And so that's one of the ways that, you know, I still remember that this work is focused on love. And I think my commitment to really being passionate that, you know, education is one of the ways forward. It is the biggest tool that we have. I think that's something that, helps me stay motivated. I think my own experiences in the world, which are often filled with injustice, seeing those experiences that my parents, my elderly parents might go through, that are injustice, that, don't respect their dignity and their everyday experiences, also mobilizes me to then use my voice more, to create this change. And I think, for me, something that I love is like just creating resources as well. I'm very passionate about, modeling what this can look like, sharing my experiences and modeling what this can look like in action for other educators. And so I don't know if there's a clear answer, but I think a lot of my own personal experiences, my passion, and my commitment to really seeing that education can mobilize us to create change, and recognizing that, equity work and social justice has always been hopeful work. It's always been rooted in resistance, strength, love, compassion, is something that drives me a little bit. It drives me towards the goals that I have.
I want to add something onto this point, because there are so many people like who cares about social justice, and you see them burn out. You see them burn out all the time. And I have attended many workshops where it has been said that they burn out. What helps me all the time is coming from Eastern philosophy, coming from Buddhist philosophy, is this three simple principle. It's just trying to understand that when I'm engaging in something, there's a profound difference between compassion and empathy. A lot of the times we use them synonymously, but they're very different. Empathy is the feeling that I feel when I look at my child, my own siblings, my own family. It is biological. It is genetic. It is there. It's primordial. But then our mind is ignorant. A lot of the times the mind can be ignorant. So what happens that I differentiate between me and Rabia? Well, I have a sister. I care about all her well-being, but Rabia is not my sister. Why should I care for her well-being, right? So what happens that our mind's ignorance, it differentiates between Rabia and my sister. So I will hurt Rabia to benefit my sister. Now, if I ask you, again, this is basically from very Buddhist philosophy, is that if you have a thorn, I don't know if I said the word right, like, the prickly thing, thorn in your feet, and your hand goes and takes the thorn out, does the feet tell the hand thank you? Or does the hand need the gratitude message from the feet, like, oh, I took the thorn out? Because the hand does not feel separated from the thorn, from the feet. So basically, and there's a very prominent Indian philosopher that has helped me so much. His name is Jiddu Krishna. He was a philosopher, Jiddu Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti has given a very powerful philosophy, is that our violence towards each other comes from our assumed separation, which our ego makes us think. If you look at white men's obsessions of colonizing the world, colonizing the space, colonizing, or men's obsession with controlling and colonizing women's body, is that somehow it's the fact that as if I can gain power over something. But if I did not think you to be separate from me, I would not hurt you, because hurting you is just like hurting me. And this is purely from Eastern philosophy. So there's three principles. One is that to be able to stand with and bear witness. A lot of the times we want to stay away from difficult, hard scenes and scenarios, because looking at those difficult scenes, it makes us feel, and this is, you can look it up. You will find in our Buddhist psychological literature, it's called empathic distress. If a doctor would faint looking at a bleeding patient, the doctor would not be able to save that patient's life. A doctor may be able to succeed in saving a patient's life, or maybe not. But at that time, a doctor is moved by the commitment of service with the humility that I can probably care. But when you and I come from a place of cure, that I know enough, that I can cure, we slide into empathic distress, right? So, and this is where I often go to Arundhati Roy's commitment never to look away from what is grotesquely brutal and violent, but always stay with love. Never to respect or worship power, but always to respect and appreciate or worship love. So that's why I say that love needs to be very political. Understand what love is. So this is something very, very important. I think Shumi has asked another question: that who is that Egyptian feminist? So her name is Mona Eltawi. Actually, I'll just quickly type the article that you can find. Okay, it's a Vice article. So you will see that Mona Eltawi, there's a Vice article that Mona Eltawi would like to. I'm not gonna say the swear word, but one of the things she talks about is that civility in politics. Is that how, particularly imagine how the politeness discourse has been used to silence women. Be quiet, be silent, be I don't know, that sort of discourse. So this is very important to be unapologetic and impolite. Otherwise, this will. And also, I also want to mention another very, very prominent Egyptian. I think the world is very grateful to her. Is that Nawal Sadawi? She died. She is. You see, a lot of the times we think that feminism is a Western invention. Look at Nawal Sadawi's life, her entire life's work. The West has learned so much from her. But this is also the West is very good at. Europe is very good at. Deny the root of knowledge. You see, it's interesting. If you look at the history timeline, you will see that European Renaissance, just before that is the Dark Age, where the Islamic Golden Age in Cordoba, in Spain, when the Christians and Muslims and Jews together, they have brought about remarkable, phenomenal changes. So I have a friend, who has done her PhD on, Cordoba, where she and I were having a conversation, and she was saying is that Europeans learned how to shower from from the Middle East, but now who are the ones who said all of that? So denial. So the Western credible capacity of denying the contribution of the other part of the world, that's incredibly important. Rabia, talking to you, I also feel this is probably is needed so much, is that next time, in terms of solidarity, if I need to reach out to somebody, I won't feel hesitant to reach out to saying that, hey, Rabia, let's do this workshop. Let's create this space of conversation, because our silence doesn't do anybody good. Mm-hmm. Last question to you. I'm sorry, I have taken longer than I requested.
No, it's been such an amazing space. I'm so honored to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabia. What are some of the changes you want to see in recent days to promote social justice education, particularly Canadian context and broadly in North American context?
Yeah, I think that is such a good question. I think, I'll speak to it in terms of my work. My own experiences, being a teacher, being a student in the system, being a person who's grown up here, I kind of came out of the education system really detached from identities, where we had to give up parts of who we were to fit in or to be Canadian. And we didn't really have that much discourse on really centering our identities and all parts of who we are. And so a lot of my work now is thinking critically about my own identity, but it's also creating spaces, whatever teaching assignment I have, whatever grade I have, is creating spaces where identities of my students are centered. And I think it might sound simplistic, but I think one of the things that I would like to see is educators, really striving to continue. And I think educators do this already. And I think I would just, encourage them to do this a lot more, is just to really contextualize their work in their community that they're serving or that they're positioned and located, and to really create learning environments and spaces where the identities of the students in the space are affirmed, but also expanded. And so, I'll talk a little bit about a previous assignment that I had where I was teaching in a mostly white community. And I was like this teacher that they've never really seen a teacher who looks like me before. And so the work in that community was affirming children's identities and experiences, but also recognizing that a lot of these children's experiences are already affirmed daily in media, in curriculum. So then really using that space to center identities that, were maybe not in their local community, or just like the exposure wasn't there, but really to do it in an authentic, everyday way. So really, I think, what I want to see is more affirming spaces, but also more spaces that expand the lived experiences and identities of our children in a very authentic way. And I think we can only do that by creating relationships with families so that they feel comfortable. So I think what I would say is, really centering identities. And in line with that, we have to center and build relationships with our families. And really, as educators, I want to see more focus on asset-based language when we're talking about our children. And what I mean by that is, let's look at all of the beautiful things our children are bringing with them. This has been something that I've really learned this year, where it's like, this program that I'm teaching is colonial in many ways, where, they have to learn English. But how can I intentionally disrupt even that program? And I can do that by centering identities, honoring my students, and recognizing the assets that they're bringing. So I see that there needs to be a lot more in that. And I think, what I'm learning about recently is how colonization has separated our stories and our experiences by making them into neat packages and showing that they're not like interconnected. I really want to see, and I guess I imagine this work may be happening with the types of resources that we use to, carry out curriculum, is to see more interconnections between cultures, people, religions. And I think that can only happen by learning our history and the story of this land. Who was here, who helped who was missing. And so I guess I see my work a lot in like focusing on teacher education, whatever that means and looks like. And then also practice in terms of curriculum and how it's delivered. So I wish to see two of those changes within educators, and then also curriculum. So really theory to practice in that way.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabia. And I have learned so much today, and I'll go and revisit, this conversation and take notes, and also see that, what kind of questions our students. So what happens is that this Canada-Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance, it works in tandem with another project which is called World School of Bangladesh. So that entire project was created. One of the realities in Bangladesh is that you have different kinds of school system, where the most privileged rich ones, they go to private elite British school systems, and those are the students who end up, and that's where I have taught for a very long time, end up going to places like Harvard and Oxford and Princeton, right? Mm-hmm. And they come back with enormous symbolic capital and what have you. So we have created a space where that space, that school can be actually used for promoting critical consciousness. So young students starting from high school to undergraduate students, they will listen to this conversation, and they actually engage in critical conversation among themselves. And someday I would love you to actually join those students and actually hear what they have to say. You can probably learn from their experience. I'm sure that you can also teach there too. I don't think that social justice is a countrywide experience, project. It's a global project, and I would love you to join the project.
Yeah, I would be honored. It would be such a privilege. I think this conversation, what you've said is, it's a global it's a global project. If we and I think that goes back into seeing ourselves as all being interconnected. So what happens in one part of the world impacts another part of the world. And if we want to really mobilize and create inclusion, equity, and justice for people of all intersectional identities, we all have to be playing a role in this in different places, in different positions. And I think that's one of the only ways that we can really create like a wholesome change, where we can really make an impact, whether that's local impact, broader, or global.
Yeah, absolutely, Rabia. I couldn't agree more with you. I wish you a wonderful day ahead, and thank you very much for making some time, for us. And as I said in the beginning, that this is just the beginning of our collaboration. I would love you to join us whenever time permits you. And because it's a continuous process. What we have learned today, if you reflect, things will unfold into you. Things will have different meaning. So definitely, we need to also talk a lot about decolonization, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism in education system, structural inequality, so on and so forth. I wish you, a wonderful day ahead, and thank you very much. And also, I just want to recognize one more comment, and Shruti has mentioned, very, very true. It is important that we talk about immigrant, complicity on indigenous land. Absolutely, couldn't agree more with you. Bonita's work, and yes, absolutely, is that how we are complicit in the process, and so true. Harsha Wali is a great person in that context, that who talks about she would rather be not a model minority, side with the indigenous people's resistance, and also the Black people. And I have learned so much from her. So thank you for that comment. And Shumi, once again, yes, the most amazing contributors are coming from village schools till now. I mean, I agree with you. This is true. If you look at the bulk, those village students, they're not privileged systematically. So yes, and thank you so much, Shumi, for giving your wonderful observations and comments. I wish you a wonderful day too. In Bangladesh, it is now night. In Canada, it's day. Have a wonderful day, Rabia.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was so awesome to just listen and learn and share. And I look forward to working together in the future.
Thank you, Rabia. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.